All right, this is Church History 1. We're lecturing today on Augustine, St. Augustine, the great saint of the Western Church. So, we are picking up, we are following up our lecture on Voices from the West, talking about Ambrose and Jerome on Monday by talking about a leading figure in all of Christianity, that is St. Augustine today. And so, we're going to spend some time with Augustine, and we're going to look at a little bit of his primary source material, as we did the other day. Though I don't have a handout for you today, I'll plop it up on the screen. And again, you were supposed to read it as well for class, so hopefully you've engaged with that a little bit. Now, Augustine, as we just learned by means of our pop quiz, is born in northern Africa. Augustine is born in northern Africa. You can look at our map over here of the early Christian Roman world, or as well kind of mapped here on the screen. Again, you can see Christian areas in the darker green that exist around circa 300, so right before the Constantinian kind of switchover. Areas that were Christianized between 300 and 600 would be the lighter green here, so certainly a much greater expanse of the population. And then areas that were Christianized from 600 to 800 up here in pink. But do note that in the 7th century, of course, we have North Africa conquered by the Islamic invasions, and we'll get to that period of history a little bit later. But suffice to say, at the time in which Augustine is born, this is a very Christian area, the northern African region. He's born in 354 in Tagaste or Tagaste, North Africa. His father was not a Christian, though I believe he converts later. His mother, Monica, is a Christian, is a believer. And of course, remember once again, Augustine is born after the time of Constantine. Constantine has passed away by this point. The Arian controversy is kind of going on, settled kind of more by 381 or so at the Council of Constantinople, which happens when he's still a relatively young man at the age of 27. So those kind of controversies that are taking part in the Christian world that we've been talking about thus far are not necessarily as much on the radar of Augustine. Now Augustine, though he lives in the Christian orbit in some sense, certainly because his mother is a Christian, he himself admits to or characterizes his earlier life as being worldly in his youth. And he indeed, not turning to the study of theology initially, studies like a good Roman boy, like a good Roman scholar, he studies rhetoric, the art of speaking, the art of communicating. And this is a not uncommon activity and practice for people who were so inclined in the ancient world. He speaks of his mother Monica as well as being influential in his life, and here he is and here she is praying for him, and all of this sort of relationship here as she wants him to embrace the Christian faith, but he does sort of resist kind of, the story could be told in the sense that he resists this at a certain level. Moving on, we can talk about, in addition to sort of engaging with rhetoric and philosophy at a certain level, Augustine, as a seeker for truth, we might say, embraces a teaching known as Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism was a religious system, perhaps not entirely dissimilar to, and again it's in the news now, Star Wars, the light side and the dark side, kind of a dualistic system, right? I know that Yoda says the dark side is not stronger, but I don't know, they killed all the Jedi. Seems pretty strong to me. But in a dualistic system, it's almost like the dark and the light, the good and the evil are kind of oppositely and almost equally opposed. There's a certain balance there, and it's constantly a back and forth. This radical dualism that the Manichees posit between light and darkness, between good and evil, we might say, was one of the was in some ways his embrace of Manichaeanism was connected to problems that he had or concerns he had about Christian theodicy. Theodicy is often called the problem of evil. In other words, we all deal with this, right? If God exists, and God is good, which Christians affirm, then why do bad things happen, right? Either God is all good, but not all powerful, right? Because he wants good things to happen, but he's not able to make everything happen. Or he's all powerful, but he can't be all good. Because if he was all powerful and he was all good, no bad thing would happen. And framed in a certain way, that's the big question that we have when we think about an omnipotent deity, right? That can be a big question. So why do bad things happen? Well, it might be easier to say why Hitler killed the Jews, because humanity is evil and broken and fallen. Okay, we get that at a certain level. But still, why did God let that happen, right? God could have stopped that, right? But then even a bigger question arises if you have like a hurricane or a tsunami, right? No human being caused that. Now, human beings may have built systems that cause people to have substandard living conditions, but still, natural disasters are natural disasters and people are going to die. You know, and there's no human being that causes that, at least directly, as far as we know. And so a dualistic system, though, that maybe more readily posits good versus light, evil versus darkness, and maybe a less, not focusing on just one omnipotent God in that way, it does provide an answer to the problem of evil, right? In a certain sense, maybe that God is not all-powerful. There's not an all-powerful good force out there. But indeed, there are other things at work here. So, I'm clearly painting with a broad brush here, and Manichaeism ought to be unpacked a lot more, but we can understand it maybe in a certain light in that way. And so this is kind of a sect, a religious approach to thinking about these ultimate realities that Augustine was connected with and embracing with. He didn't think that it solved all of his questions, though, and he was told at one point, oh, just go see this one teacher and he will explain all of your answers. And eventually he did get to talk with that teacher and he wasn't satisfied. So his searcher's heart is not entirely satisfied with what he sees in Manichaeism. Augustine also comes to be influenced then by Neoplatonism, which is, as you can tell by the very phrasing of the word here, the term here, neo meaning new, Platonism having to do with philosophy of the Greek scholar Plato. And of course, trying to go through all of his philosophical approach in a brief lecture like this is a tall order, but I will give you the briefest of introductions to Plato, or indeed Neoplatonic thought. So Plato has this famous analogy, the analogy or the allegory of the cave. Anybody familiar with the allegory of the cave? David, what happens in the allegory of the cave?
Allegory of the cave is the one where you have three guys looking at a rock wall with shadows bouncing off of it, right? And there's the light outside of the cave? Or am I missing?
Kind of, okay, so, Colton, get up here, stand up here. Yeah. All right, face the screen here. Face the screen here. All right, so, Colton, you're chained down. You can't move, you can't face the way here. There's a fire behind you, and, and the only thing you ever see is this, okay, on the wall. The only thing you ever see. Your whole life, that's all you see, right?
Oh,
what do you think reality is?
Shadows and...
What's a shadow? You don't know. All you ever see is this. So this is what you think reality looks like, right?
That's weird.
It would drive you insane, but that's what you think reality looks like. All right, and then Alexa. Come here, Alexa. Okay, Alexa comes up here, and she unchains you. Oh, sorry. Unchain him, Alexa. Okay, turns you around, and you see the projector, and you see this room. You don't see the people, but you see the room.
Okay.
What do you think real reality is now?
Nothing. It's not
Well,
real.
Well, that was not real, but this must be real, right?
Oh, this is real now?
But it's still kind of dark, right? It's not exactly bright, but what you see, you think that's all the reality is, right?
It's just a shadow. Well, I thought
Or it's just kind of a dark, gloomy room, but it's still more exciting for you than staring at a wall, right?
Yeah.
Something different. Okay, now Alexia, we're not going to do this, but Alexia actually takes you outside, and you see the Cascades, and the sky, and the trees, and then you realize that reality is even bigger than you thought before.
So I feel like an ant.
Yeah, and now in the light, you can see things so much more clearly, and then you look up to, well, if it's a good day, you look up to the sun, and you can barely understand what you're seeing. It's so bright and beyond your comprehension. And so far, that is from what you used to think the whole world was made up of, right?
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So that's basically how the allegory of the cave goes, right? And so the idea is there that the sun, that big ball of flame in the sky, there is the source of all truth and seeing things clearly and whatnot, even if that might be ineffable or ununderstandable. And the closer Colton got to the light that illumines all things, the closer he was to true reality, right? And so, the further away you get from the sun, the further away you get from the light, the further away you get from the one, so to speak, the imparticipable, the further away you emanate from there, the further you are from ultimate truth and ultimate being. And while there are elements of this shadowed out into all of these circles, these concentric circles, the further away you get from it, right, the further you are from ultimate truth. And so there was an element to this being a kind of reality for you, right? There was an element that this dark room was reality. There was an element that the trees were reality, but ultimate reality is and derives from the sun that illumines all things and gives light to all things. That's kind of the philosophical approach of Plato. Plato also is, if you want to understand, Plato also understood philosophically things in terms of forms, right? Like, how are these chairs? Well, these are chairs because they correspond to an idea of, an idea or an eternal form that's called chair. And as these correspond to that eternal idea of what chair is, that's what it is. Or love, for instance. Maybe it's a better example than a chair, right? So you see a mother with a 4-year-old boy. He falls over, skins his knee. She picks him up, kisses his knee, and they hold hands walking down the street. You see that, you say that's love. Why is that love? Because that corresponds to a larger philosophical idea of what we think love is. An eternal concept of love. That's kind of Plato's idea. You can already begin to see how this can connect with Augustine as he conceives Christianity in kind of a Platonic or a Neoplatonic way. What is evil? Well, here's the thing. No, absence. Evil is not a thing. It's the absence of something else. Right? What is darkness? Darkness is not a thing. It's just the absence of light. What is evil? Evil is when we begin to turn our back to and turn away from truth. And the further away we go, the more things get mixed, so to speak. C.S. Lewis, I mentioned, is kind of, I think, influenced by this Augustinian Neoplatonic tradition. He talks about sin as being bent, and so in one of his books, it might be the Space Trilogy, if you've read that, he talks about evil as being, evil creatures being bent ones, in his understanding of this. If you think about things this way, in the way that this Neoplatonic philosophy impacts Augustine, it also gives him a bridge from the philosophical world, and maybe even some of his struggles that he had connected with Manichaeism, then into Christianity, as we think about the problem of evil. Now we can say that evil is not a thing that's opposed to God. Evil is just the way things are separated from God. Evil, in other words, is the negation of good, not its own thing. Neoplatonism sought, the goal of Neoplatonism was to reach the ineffable one. There were these theories of emanations. You slowly emanate out from the center. And of course, evil as the negation of good. And Augustine eventually comes to a place where he becomes a Christian. Augustine is in Milan at a certain point, way up here. Milan, of course, is where St. Ambrose is hanging out and doing his bishop thing. And he goes and he listens to Ambrose preach. And remember, Augustine is trained in rhetoric, right? And so he's curious about Ambrose's sermons, perhaps philosophically, but definitely probably rhetorically. And as he listens to them and engages with them, he is moved, slowly but surely, I don't know how quickly it happens, but he's moved to embrace Christianity, though it took him time to completely commit. It did take him time to completely commit. Eventually, he looks to travel back to North Africa. His mother dies while traveling with him, while he's on his way to travel back to North Africa. In North Africa, he's eventually elected Bishop of Hippo. I know the name Hippo makes us smile because we think of the big water beast. They are dangerous, actually. But Hippo Regius is here on the coast, not too far from Carthage. He's made the bishop of this town here in North Africa. And of course, he's involved, and we'll talk about it, in a number of theological and church enterprises during his time there as the Bishop of Hippo. He dies in the year 430 with, and I believe this is literally true, barbarians at the gates of his town. As the Roman Empire this empire that valued studying rhetoric and the classical world and everything in the West is really beginning to collapse here. And really collapsing in a kind of apocalypse like we only see on television today. There were elements of it that remained, but really the firm, focused, coordinated Roman Empire of centuries past was fading away. Rome itself had been sacked in 410, and possibly a couple additional times since then, between then and 430. And as I said before, the sort of my ancestors, the Germans, came in. You can see here on this map, and we can't see this with the video camera, but these are Eastern and Germanic migrations to 486. And so you can see Germanic tribes, like the Huns coming here from all over here into Italy. You have others coming down into here through Spain and North Africa, the Vandals, from whence we get the word vandalism, right? And of course they're coming right through North Africa here. 429, they're right here, so there's Hippo. Up through here, sacking Rome in 410. So all these things taking place as Rome is just overrun by. I know what Donald Trump would say, he would say build a wall, but they tried that actually. Up here, they did build a wall. They built Hadrian's Wall back in the day to keep the Scottish people out. So, there you go. Donald Trump would be like, make Rome great again. So, Augustine is remembered as a quote-unquote doctor of the church. There's not very many of these. I don't know exactly what the number is, but not very many people have been given this title. He is indeed one of the greatest and most influential theologians in Christianity of all time. And that's not really an understatement here. Maybe you could debate how great he was, but if you measure his greatness by his influence, absolutely. One of the greatest and most influential theologians in the West, in Christianity of all time. Now, what are his key thoughts and his theology? Here he is. Well, Augustine, some of his story we remember in personal terms because he's really, in some ways, inventing the idea of the autobiography through his own autobiography called the Confessions. But he has a personal journey of faith that I think people have identified with. He, for instance, lives life on what we might consider to be the wild side, a little bit younger, in his younger years. He talks about getting, I think, to Carthage at one point, a boiling cauldron of sin or something like this. He takes a concubine and has a concubine and a child by the concubine. One of his recorded sort of prayers, or maybe even reflecting back on his earlier life, is this. He says, Lord, give me chastity and give me continence, but not too soon. But not yet. And he also has that famous phrase, perhaps you've heard, there's a hole inside of you that you want to try to fill with so many things, but you need to fill it with Jesus. Well, that's just a riff on Augustine saying, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee, O God. Yeah, and this is, and if you track Augustine's story in a certain way, you can kind of see some of this at work in the way that he understands his own story. Augustine Augustine clarifies certain thoughts that he has about sin and what he calls concupiscence. Let me see if we have a marker here today. No, we don't. Oh, there's one. Sin and what he calls concupiscence. I don't know if that. Let's try to see if I wrote this correctly. Yeah, it's that first C. Good, okay. Concupiscence, which is kind of like this sin that we have with us that we carry with us probably as a marker of original sin or inherited sin or our bent to sinning perhaps. As Augustine reflects on sin, and I believe this is a quotation from his Confessions, he says this, reflecting on when he was younger and he stole fruit from a pear tree, which may not seem to us to be the best example of sin, but listen to the way that he unpacks what's happening here in his life and in his heart as he looks inside. Those pears that we stole were fair to the sight because they were thy creation, O beauty beyond compare. So, you might say here, we stole those pears because they were fair and beautiful. So there's something good in those pears and something good about in them that made us want them, but we stole them, which was a kind of a negation of the good almost. So you can almost maybe hear a Neoplatonic maybe reflection in there. I'll continue. And then he says, "We're thy creation, O beauty beyond compare, O creator of all, O thou good God. God the highest good," that's centered, right? "And my true good." Those pairs were truly pleasant to the sight, but it was not for them that my miserable soul lusted. So maybe he's not being entirely Neoplatonic there. Maybe I'm reading into it. We'll see. "For I had an abundance of better pairs. I stole that pair, not because I wanted it. I had other pairs. Why did I steal it then? I stole those simply that I might steal. For having stolen them, I threw them away. My sole gratification in them was my own sin, which I was pleased to enjoy. For if any one of those pears entered my mouth, the only good flavor it had was my sin in eating it. And now, O Lord my God, I ask what it was in that theft of mine that caused me such delight. For behold, it had no beauty of its own, certainly not the sort of beauty that exists in justice and wisdom, nor such as is in the mind, memory senses, and the animal life of man." Think about that, right? It wasn't that I wanted pears, I wanted the sin. I had this is a part of who I am, very interesting to think about. When we talk about the doctrine of original sin, or sin in some sense passed down, inherited, affecting us from the original sin of Adam and Eve, Augustine also ties this in some sense to sex. Sex is connected to original sin. Not the sex act itself, so to speak, but in the sex act might be the place where sin is passed down, inherited, if you will. Of course, this could be, anyway. Concupiscence, in other words, is this desire that we have, this sinful desire that we have that is opposed to God. Baptism, according to Augustine, remits our sin guilt. And I don't have this whole theology in front of me, but I would assume that he'd be saying that baptism being more than just going down in the water and saying a few words, but being as a sign of repentance, that the whole togetherness with it. But even though sin guilt is remitted, our concupiscence remains, even after we are baptized believers. Understanding this, you might understand why he stands against a theologian named Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was, I believe, a British monk, and he believed that actually, as opposed to a more negative conception of the fallenness of our own will, or the concupiscence inside of us, that we are actually able to overcome sin. We are able to overcome sin. And I think according to his logic, you would say, well, if we're not able to overcome sin, that's not quite fair that we're judged for it because we don't have an opportunity to, right? I think that's some of his logic there. See, here's the thing. For Augustine, though, he would say no. And he argued with Pelagius on these points of discussing sin. He said, before the fall, before that day in the garden, humanity was free either to sin or not to sin. That's our freedom. Our freedom was bounded. Our freedom existed in the freedom to choose sin or not to sin. After the fall, though, we are only free to sin. You are not free not to sin. That's not a choice open to you because of the fall. You are free to sin in any number of ways that you'd like to choose. There's lots of them, right? You have that freedom, but not a freedom not to sin. Or or perhaps a better way to put it maybe would be not free to have your actions not tainted by, affected by, influenced by, connected to sin. As Christians, we are free to sin or not to sin. And in heaven, we are free, but we're only free not to sin. We're free not to sin in many different ways, and we're free to choose amongst them, but we're only free not to sin. So that kind of conceptuality there. And so this more optimistic approach of Pelagius that says, no, we're actually able to follow God and choose certain things, and we're free not to sin. Augustine would say, you're way too optimistic about the concupiscent state of our being, or the fallenness of our nature. This kind of debate is, in some ways picked up again during the Reformation by inheritors of Calvin and whatnot. This kind of, such that, I was reading a book by R.C. Sproul, who's sort of a neo-reformed author, And he calls the sort of Arminian position that believes free will, like we can choose to accept God's grace or whatever. He would say, no, that's not right. That's actually semi-Pelagian. No, Dr. Ziefle, you're semi-heretic. That's probably true. But that's a different. I was just telling Dr. Wisemore today, I'm probably a modalist and all sorts of things. So. I'm reading this book by Jaroslav Pelikan. I think I told you about the history of doctrine. And so last night I was reading, and it really confirmed for me that I'm not a theology professor, or that I don't like it as much as maybe history. All this stuff about ousia, apostasies, and the Trinity, and it's, I mean, I get it at a certain level because I've studied it and worked through some of it, but it's just, yeah. You really see some of the Greek influence of the impassivity of God connecting with all of this, and then just a lot of different things. And part of me wonders, I don't know, how about we just trust God? being very Pentecostal, I guess. Well, Now, when we talk about Augustine's soteriology, we might talk about God's grace that comes to us and connects to us from God. We might also talk about soteriology and questions of predestination that, again, we reflect on in the Reformation era. But Augustine, certainly with this idea of original sin and concupiscence, has a certain perspective on what's happening in the midst of the human being. Okay? Another controversy Augustine faced is Donatism. Donatism being a debate similar to one that happened kind of with Cyprian innovation earlier in the church. This is the situation where, again, in North Africa, there are churches who felt they were more pure than other parts of the church, perhaps because they were their bishops did not, their ordinations were not from bishops that had given up the Bibles during persecution or the faith or whatnot. And so the Donatists felt that if you, Alexa, got married, but Micah was a priest, and he had been a part of a church that was apostate, in other words, that you were ordained by someone who had given in under martyrdom and then was readmitted to the church or something like that, that Alexa's wedding wouldn't be valid because your ordination isn't valid. So Alexa, sorry, you're living in sin. So and so on and so forth, things like that. So Augustine and others struggle with the Donatists in North Africa and eventually basically says, listen, the unity of the church is not such that we have to be constantly worried about who's pure and who's right and all these kind of things, right? And that would mean that think about that. If that was the case, if no good could come of anything without doing a firm inspection of every priest's actions or whatnot, it would be chaos. And indeed, the church is bigger than that. And Augustine, this idea coming from the Latin, ex opere operato, in other words, if somebody's out of the thing itself, it works. I don't know if that's an exact translation, but out of the thing itself, it works. In other words, if David is offering communion and yet his ordination is invalid, the communion is valid because of the act of communion, not because of David. In the same way, Alexa, your marriage is still good. You're fine.
Whew.
Yeah, you and let's see, Conrad.
Oh, promising name.
Yeah, Conrad. So that would be fine. Even though and so what Augustine is asserting in some ways is the unity of the church as a corpus per mixtum or mixed body, wheat and tares type of thing, as opposed to a more pure conception of Christianity. And that has implications, right? I mean, this has big implications. Sort of a big tent approach for Christianity in that way. Augustine is also reflecting on just war theory. It's just war. Just war theory posits a number of different things today, but we can talk about three with regards to Augustine. First of all, if you're going to fight a war or engage in some kind of military action, your purpose must be just. You must have a good reason for it. Not just a good reason, but a just, a righteous reason for doing so. So, for instance, Hitler has invaded Europe and is oppressing people. We didn't quite know about the Holocaust initially, but still, freedoms are being denied. Going to war against Hitler, justified, right? Okay. We like that Canada has lots of oil up there, and so we invade them. Not really justified, just what we want. We're stealing, basically stealing, I don't think we're invading Canada. but you never know if we elect Donald Trump. Sorry, I'm on a Donald Trump kick today. Second, war must be waged by a properly instituted authority. You just can't get a bunch of people together and go to war with Canada. You're not a justly authorized authority. Sorry. Number three, the motive must be love. Are we motivated by aggression, hatred here, or indeed out of love as an end result here? This just war theory could be used militarily, it could be used against the heretics as well, if you think about it. Actions against heretics, like perhaps maybe the Donatists, if they're being repressed. I mentioned earlier Augustine's great work of autobiography, the Confessions. He invented the art of the spiritual autobiography. He sets the standard. I mean, this is what he's doing. When I talk about influence, I'm not kidding. Oh, here we go. So speaking about his struggles with sex, and some of the early church fathers, Jerome, Augustine, their reflections on sex certainly have impact in the way we might think about these things. But he says this when he's a younger man, reflecting on when he's a younger man about his arrival, I believe, in Carthage. He says this: "There seethed around me a cauldron of lawless loves. I loved not yet I loved to love. And out of a deep-seated want, I hated myself for wanting not. I sought that I might love, in love with loving, and I hated safety. To love then and be beloved was sweet to me. But more, when I obtained to enjoy the person I loved. I defiled, therefore, the spring of friendship with the filth of concupiscence, and I beclouded in its brightness with the hell of lustfulness." Thanks for sharing, Augustine. Appreciate that. He has this eventually. When he does become converted later on, he has this really interesting moment in a garden, I believe, which of course is interestingly symbolic, right? In a garden. He's in the garden. He's there with a friend of his, I think. And he hears a child's voice that says in Latin, "Tolle lege," which means take and read. Take and read. And so he opens the Bible and he reads, I think it might be from Romans, and he has this moment of conversion here in this garden. Of his own personal faith, because he's a little older when he converts, I don't remember exactly what age, but he's not like 10 when he converts, it's older. He's kind of in his early career or so. He says this of his faith: "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient and ever new. Late have I loved you, and behold, you were within me, and I out of myself, and there I searched for you." Poetic, beautiful. Gives you a sense of some of his own spirituality. The Confessions is one of his great works, and he wrote a number of different things. The other major of his works is known as the City of God. The City of God. In the City of God, he is in some ways addressing the confusion of the Roman Empire with the God they had turned to in significant measure at the time when the Western Roman Empire is in its decline and fall. Pagans could be seen to blame Christianity for Rome's decline. Oh, look at that. The emperor converts to Christianity. What happens within 100 years? Bye-bye Rome, or so, 150 years. Could the two be connected? I don't know. Maybe a similar kind of argument on some pagans as some people in the United States have. Well, America's not great anymore. We just need to go back to our traditional religion. Now, in our case, that would be Christianity, true religion, capital T. But in the Romans' case, true conservatives would say we just need to go back and slit open some bulls and shower their blood again. We need to worship Zeus some more. You know what? We've really been getting away from that. You know what? Have you been doing your Sibylline oracle devotions today? No. See? This is why things aren't good. And so on and so forth. Cold. You don't do.
It's okay.
Yeah. First you're staring at the wall, and then Alexia has to come help you out.
I was just being a lunatic right now.
Oh, Colton. We love you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you will.
Even though you're full of concupiscence.
I don't even know what that word means.
What happens in 410 AD? Well, you can't see it here, but on this map, in 410, Rome is sacked. The eternal city, the capital of the empire, is invaded by barbarians. That, I mean, that was a sign of something. A sign of something. A shock. We're used to in the United States, America being on top of the world. And in a lot of ways, we are, rightly or wrongly. It's how it is. We're born into this world. And if one day when you're an older person, I don't know how to, I won't name whatever invader, who knows who it could be. If you see, if China nukes Washington, D.C., or the caliphate is set up in Texas, or whatever it might be, when you think of contemporary people we might see as enemies, and America is no more, it would just blow your mind and cause you to raise good questions. I thought we were God's nation. I thought we had a purpose. I thought we had a plan. Multiply that now in the Roman Emperor when the Christian church has kind of won. I thought this was what God was doing. I thought this was, something eschatological here in some sense. And now the city of God, Rome herself, so to speak, or the new empire of God has fallen. And there are questions. Now Augustine, as he reflects in his book, The City of God, is, I think, perhaps playing with what we would call in theology the difference between the already and the not yet when we think about the kingdom of God. And all of you have had Christian thought, or many of you by this point, this idea that there are certain things about the kingdom of God that are already taking place and at work now because of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. But there are other things that are not yet fulfilled. And so, for instance, we can speak of the gospel going forth in good news in this world, right? And yet that good news is met by sin and depravity at every corner. And even in our own efforts to do right, they're mixed with other things sometimes. We can talk about the ways in which the church is in the world advancing in love and in action. We can also talk about the ways in the world is still a very broken place. And the church too can do that sometimes. So there are already things that are taking place, but not yet. Moreover, he would draw a distinction between the city of God as being God's heavenly city yet to come. It is eternal, as opposed with the city of man, which is passing. And Rome is not the city of God, right? Rome is the city of man. We don't put our hopes in Rome, right? We don't put our hopes in Washington, D.C. We don't put our hopes in who gets elected next year, right? We put our hopes in Jesus Christ. There's a difference between the city of God and the city of man. He says this, justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? God uses the human city, but God is not coterminous with it. God's purposes in the city of God is not exhausted by the city of man. You read a bit of the City of God, excerpt from the City of God document in your reading for today. And we don't have much time left, so I'll leave these as rhetorical questions for you. When you think about Augustine's times, the changing times in which he found themselves, when you think about this discussion of the city of God, the city of man, they might ask us to, we might again step away from the purely historical and think about our own situation as believers in this world now. What might Augustine have to say to America that has sort of seen itself as kind of a Christian land for a long time? What is that illumined and what is that obscured? How would Augustine instruct you and me, us, to interact with our current political system? What about in relation to the rest of the world? What would Augustine have to say about our domestic and foreign policies? What does it mean to talk about the city of God and the city of man today? And so, in Augustine, we see one of the last sort of moments of sort of flowering of Christianity in the Western Roman world. Though that said, I will say that it's not my understanding that like 476 comes around, which is kind of an arbitrary date they picked. The last Roman emperor is kind of deposed. His name is Romulus Augustulus. He's like a boy emperor. But remnants of Rome remains. There arises something called the Holy Roman Empire later on, but it's very different than it used to be. And certainly the Germanic tribes, when they come in, they're also kind of Romanizing themselves, but the empire as it had been is kind of all sort of broken apart. And we really enter into this period of time that history recalls as being the Dark Ages. Early medieval, which is kind of just a time of chaos, and then the Vikings will show up eventually. That's a whole different thing. But that's our friend Augustine, and his writings in Latin and his work there will come to be very influential. Even some of his ideas that I shared with today, you might not agree with all of their implications, but they rang as familiar to you. Probably because his ideas have influenced the way we see Scripture, the way we understand church, and theology. So, thank you all. We'll be back together next Monday. A reminder to keep on your calendar, November 1st, I think it is, the Compline service, and I'll be letting you know where we'll be having dinner beforehand. So, thank you.
Thank you.